So we'll start, we're going to talk about one of my favorite physics concepts called superposition, which has been greatly overlooked for 100 years, and it needs to be taught, and I think it needs to be taught in elementary school. But for sure, I want to make sure you all understand it and make it applicable. So if I said, who understands superposition in this room? You don't get to say. Who understands superposition?
I know what it is, but I don't understand it.
No, I was hoping you would say none of you. Okay. Okay. This is ultimately the point. It's like one of the most important things man has ever figured out, and it should blow your mind in many different ways. And it's so wonderfully practically applicable that it really should be a word that elementary school students know. Now, let me first start by pointing out one of my newest favorite Bible verses, Psalm 19:7. The laws of the Lord are perfect; it will restore your soul. The laws of the Lord are perfect. It will restore your soul. That means part of the laws, the physical stuff that's happening, nature, if you will, knows what it's doing. Okay? I'm going to do this. It's not thinking about it. Trees aren't straining to grow. They're not thinking about it. Animals aren't strategizing. They're just being. Doing and being. That's what, they're experiencing that without the type of cognition we're used to. Well, our experiences actually fit into that because we're very animalistic in many different ways. But we have this strange quality called consciousness, which gives us a chance to think and perceive and reflect and feedback with each other, all that kind of stuff, slightly different than the way animals do it. It gives us the chance to be an observer of this nature when we're usually so ingrained in it in ways that we fail to see the bigger picture. So part of the laws of the Lord are perfect that I like is this thing called superposition. Okay, the science works really well. It's deep and simple at the same time. I'd say that's a pretty good yin-yang. My job is to make it as simple as possible for you, but it goes pretty deep. Okay, so an atom is an important thing, right? Why are atoms important?
They make up everything.
Everything in the world is made up of atoms. Okay, most people don't really know how atoms work, because we get taught wrong. All right? So I have this simple diagram. Is it this or is it that? Now we get taught that atoms, these teeny little solar systems, has a nucleus with an electron orbiting around it. And it goes in this type of shape or that type of path. It's orbiting somehow. We've known for 100 years that that's not what happens. It's not orbiting like the moon is orbiting Earth or the Earth's orbiting the sun. That's not what's happening. And yet, high school students still make models that are like that. That's false. What's actually happening is that electron is in multiple or an infinite amount of places in orbit around the nucleus. And it happens in a probabilistic way. Because if we think of this one thing traveling around, we can always find out where it is. We always know where it is. We could project where it's going to be. But that's what the physicists found out that's not what it is. The fact is that electron is a certain probability. It has a probability of being in any given place. So if I went all the way around, what would it eventually add up to?
1 or 100%.
Yeah, don't do the math, but you get the idea. Yeah. Ultimately, I'd have to have an infinite number of these electrons going around, and it's in every one of those places at the same time. An electron isn't orbiting the nucleus, it's in every single spot in the orbit around the nucleus. Now, when you go to observe this, scientists found, it shows up in one of those places. But it was only a probability that was going to be in any one of those places. You go to look and it's there. That's why we perceive it sometimes as being in orbit. But it actually is a probability of being in any one of those places. So we've got probabilities. Now the world is made up of probabilities because everything in the world is made up of atoms, and there's certain probabilities. Einstein had a concept called realism. Once again, should at least be taught in junior high. Realism. You know what realism is? Albert Einstein and friends actually had to debate whether or not the moon is there if you're not looking at it. Right? Does the moon exist if someone is not looking at it? Now, like the smartest guys ever had actually asked themselves that question. Because the science was suggesting that it might not be there if you're not looking at it. Why? Because the world is potential strips of reality. Because these atoms are just potentials. They're not facts. They're not even solid particles. They're ultimately energy wavelengths. And as he said in this video, it's a wave until you observe it, and then it's a particle. And that would mean the moon could be a wave of potential moon until somebody looks at it. Isn't that bizarre? And again, smartest guys ever have debated this. This is not people sitting around smoking something debating this. The fact is, it's an actual concept in physics. This is the whole point of ultimately the Kalama Sutta that Buddha taught thousands of years ago, which is walk your own path, okay? Walk your own path. Experiment with this stuff. We're gonna apply it in a minute. Explore this concept using the creator, if that's what works for you, consciousness, the observer, but challenge yourself to change the way your mind works and look at situations different and see if different pathways or different strips of reality show up for you. When they do, you know that it works. That's how Buddha says you figure out truth, because it works. To me, the science just made me go, wow, let me look at that. And then when I applied it a little bit, it started to work. That's how, again, you know it's true. So yeah, we want to change the idea so we can empower people throughout the world to actually understand what this is. I like to think of it as video games, right? Video games are potential strips of reality. If you're playing a video game, the programmer of the game set up every variation in the game already. I always use Pac-Man, perfect example, because everybody knows that. Pac-Man can do an infinite number of things, can he? Can he do everything? Now there's a science concept, infinite possibilities. Is infinite the same as everything? Matthew 19:26, all things are possible with God. Is everything possible, and is that the same as infinite? See, infinite is, I could put my hand in an infinite number of places. I could do that, right? You guys need me to keep going, or you get the idea? All right, you can just go on and on. I could have an infinite number of names, but I can't turn my hand into a flower. I can't grow younger. I can't regrow hair. I've tried, right? Not everything is physically possible. That's not what superposition is. There's an infinite number of variations. There's certain probabilities that any given thing is going to happen to you based upon the way you've been observing the world. Okay? I like to start with easy things, then I'll use some more dramatic things. But easier things like patience. Remember, laws of the Lord are perfect, it will restore your soul. Impatience is going to keep you stuck, and it's going to create some pain, and it's resistance, and you're going to end up with some conflict as a result. Okay? Now, anytime you go out into the street and you're driving, there's a certain probability you're going to end up in traffic. And there's a certain different intensities of traffic, right? Amounts of traffic. Also, the type of hurry that you're in. Are you late for a game versus a doctor's appointment versus a wedding? Stuff like that. But it's all probabilities. Now, the impatient person tends to look at situations like traffic differently than the patient person. Isn't that true? Now, the patient person is the observer, what you would call the creator inside the self. I like to just think of it as consciousness or your mind state. Now, if I find myself in traffic and I'm impatient, do I increase the likelihood of a car accident? Yes. Because I'm going to hurry because I'm impatient. Now, how many different types of car accident? What if I'm really impatient and I'm driving 107 miles an hour through traffic? I have a certain probability of getting into a fatal car accident. I also have a probability of getting into a minor fender bender. I mean, all these things exist as certain possibilities. The physics, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which comes from this concept, is there's an infinite array of things that could happen to you in the next 10 minutes. Right? And certainly on the street, there's an infinite array. Do you have an influence over that? Absolutely you do. That's the interplay between these two things, between the spiritual world and the physical world, or between the conscious mind world and your physical world. There's an interplay, and it's matched by these statistics. It's also known as logical. If I'm hitting a putt and it's nobody's watching, I'm way more likely to hit a 10-foot putt than if all the cameras on me, it's for $1 million or to win the Masters or just to beat my buddy for 20 bucks. I'm a lot more pressure filled, and I'll do something different with the putt. This is everything we experience in life. Anything that you can throw at me, we can throw into this paradigm. And so you affect the possibility of a certain thing happening based upon the way you're looking at it. That's called the observer effect. Because before you do the event, they're all there as possibilities. And then you go to actually act. And then one of them shows up for you. That's why it's an infinite wave of possibilities until you interact with it. Now it's a feedback loop, because if I'm all nervous hitting a putt and I miss the putt, what can I learn from that? Relax. relax, dude. Okay? Now, does relaxing, dude, lead to something called patience, which will lead to less resistance, which will lead to the awakening of my soul? Laws of the Lord are perfect. Okay? Now, what about resenting other people? What about judging other people and like obsessing over isms and really caring about all the stuff that the world argues about in a dysfunctional way? Does that lead to pleasantness in one's heart or arguments? Does it lead to a divisive world or a unified world? Well, it's also probabilities. If I'm obsessed over people's genders and races and ages and weights and sexual orientations and all that, I'm going to get into a lot of different conversations than people who are like, I accept you and I embrace you. And I understand that the laws of the Lord are perfect and I'm supposed to be doing my thing. I'm going to let you do your thing, which is why Jesus says not to judge. Don't worry about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your own. Why Buddha's last words were, strive for your own liberation with diligence. And Apostle Paul says,
work out your own salvation.
Okay.
With fear and trembling.
Yeah, the fact is, you got to do you. You have to keep doing you. You have to keep working on the self. Krishna says the self, the highest self, is when you've mastered yourself. Okay? And it's all set up with these probabilities. So what happens? You go into the world and you have experiences. And these experiences are teaching you something as a feedback loop. Now, the more and more patient I get, I change these numbers. I might even get to a place where you have a 97% likelihood, and we'll make all of these much smaller, of not getting into an accident because I'm really chill. Just patient. But it's still there as a probability. Now, here's where it gets tougher. That's an easy issue. We get that. Well, what about crazy life chaos situations? I often use 9/11 as an example. Did anybody on 9/11 attract those planes into the building? And was there a way of thinking that created that for them? No. But there was always a possibility of randomness. Now, this is what I find to be an extremely important concept. Are things random? Do random things happen? Stuff happens, as they say? Or is it by design? Yin yang. I mean, if you're playing this game, you're always going to be able to do, Joe did it and Michael did it. You can always go, well, but wait a minute, look at it that way. I'm like, well, you got me. Okay? So is it random or is it by design? Physics demonstrates a certain degree of randomness. So I'll just throw out a number. There's a certain probability, depending on, you might be the most patient guy in the world and you still get in a car accident. Right? You might do everything right physically, perfect diet, exercise all the time, still get a disease. There's randomness. Stuff happens, and it doesn't seem to be fair, right? Now, does this unfairness thing, the randomness aspect, affect everybody? Well, doesn't that make it fair then? In a big picture, again, there's a certain design going on. Again, the world is set up that way. Evolution is set up that way. We need to have jumps, random jumps, in terms of like the way DNA works and the way evolution has worked. Random jumps in behavior and genetic expression in order for things to evolve. We need to have chaos in this world for us to evolve. This is why the negative things that happen to us actually promote growth inside of us if we're willing to look at it that way. So it's the stress, like when somebody's doing the high jump and the bar's set here on them and you clear it, high fives all around. Then you look back over. What did the officials just do? Raised it on you. I'm like, I just cleared that bar. Now you have to clear that bar. You have to do more to get over that bar. What does that require? More consciousness, more focus, more spiritual awareness. The laws of the Lord are perfect. It will restore your soul. So yeah, random crappy things happen sometimes. You going to complain about it? Does that get you anywhere? Tons of unfair things have happened. Tons of. But if you can go, I'm still going to surpass this unfairness. It's like a poker player who gets a bad hand dealt to him. What does he do? Ugh. What happens when he does that? Or poker face, right? So bad things absolutely happen to people. How are you going to perceive it? Are you going to all right, raise it another inch. I'll clear that bar then, right? Isn't that fair? Because what's fair, the design, again, I'm doing this because we can take that in many different ways. The fact is, you always have the choice, the free will, to perceive the situation that you're experiencing. You always do. And it's almost always through the greatest adversities where the greatest growth. Rumi, the wound is where the light enters. if you're willing to look at this, the design of the world in this probabilistic fashion, that it's actually teaching you specifically what it is you need for growth, higher consciousness, spiritual development, now you see that the world is set up exactly like that. Potential strips of reality for us to explore. On a regular basis, I work with people who have gone through really difficult circumstances, and the debating the fairness of it or not actually doesn't really get you anywhere. It's why Rumi also said 1,000 years ago, it is what it is. It's the acceptance of, well, these are my circumstances. That actually promotes great growth and proper action. It doesn't mean you just sit there and wallow in the circumstances. You can go affect change. But you do it from a really healthy place, a place that's going to be effective, and it also changes these dynamics for the world. I mean, let's face it, this whole thing is an empowering thing. It's back to, rising tide lifts all boats, entanglement. The more I work on it, the better I get, the easier it is for you and vice versa. And then we ultimately unify in this by saying, let's all change these probabilities for ourselves. What's the ultimate thing we all have in common? Peace. That's the one thing we're all looking for. Peace inside our hearts. We've got ourselves as the human species into the situation that we're in, okay? From the beginning of time, the whole thing was set up as this probability thing, right? Whether there's a God or not is irrelevant. If it works for you, fine. If it doesn't, fine. Doesn't matter. Depends on how you define it anyways, right? But for sure we know this. The science of it is the world was a probability all along. And whatever happened from that beginning moment, the Big Bang, to the point where we got here, well, we could have steered ourselves in a different direction, but here's where we're at. Would we like to steer ourselves in a different direction in the future? Well, the world rests in infinite possibility for the future. We've got a wide array of things we could be experiencing as a human species in the future. Would we like to come together on that? Well, we got to work on our inner world first, Gandhi says, to be the change you want to see in the world. The world's a mirror for our inner tendencies. Inner tendencies, that's exactly what that is. I was born into a family that's a bunch of professors. It's not that big of a shock that I'm up here being able to talk like a professor. Right. Had I been born into a family of golfers, I might be out there hitting the ball around right now, whatever. It is what it is, right? That's also a probability thing. Right. But I'm glad you brought this up too, because the concept of illusion comes from the scientists and the prophets. I mean, it's Einstein that suggested it. Niels Bohr is the one that said nothing that we call real is really real. I mean, but to me, here's the illusion. We think it's this, but it's really that. It's not a solid thing, it's a probability thing. Right. Well, this is why we want to, if you stick to the science, you can make it academic. Right. And here, the boy in this, the little wise boy says, we're all doing it all the time anyways. It's sufficient for me, especially as a therapist, when somebody comes in, and I go straight to this paradigm, and I know it's a probability thing. Like I work with addiction a lot, and it's a certain probability when somebody's been using drugs for a long time that they're going to use tomorrow. I'm not interested, and it's almost impossible to get them to zero anyways. What we want to do is change the probabilities. That's called progress. It's also therapy. And we do that with mental health and anxiety and depression, those types of things. And we do it with our physical health. If I'm giving a diagnosis of, if I have cancer and it's a 50-50 probability that I might survive the year, and by the end of the year I've changed that probability to 75-25, did I do something? I changed the probability. I still might die though. And then people go, oh, prayer didn't work, or his mind didn't work. You just changed the probability of something, right? And again, everybody's doing it all the time. I do this with athletes. Basketball players are exceptionally good at this, and they have no clue that it even exists. They call it the zone in sports. You change the probability of making a shot by blocking everything out and focusing and being fearless. But they're attending to shooting a basketball, so they're really good at it. Okay, here's the thing. Taoism specifically says all the answers are inside of you. You don't have to understand superposition to play this game. You don't. I find it useful. Education is usually pretty empowering. But in a very high-minded, or at least I should say, intentionally good people can disagree really quickly over things, right? And so it's always about, well, what is it that you're trying to experience, or what is it that you are experiencing? And the answer is always going to be inside of everybody, and it's every single religion. Rumi, you're not a drop in the ocean, you're an ocean inside a drop. See, all of this stuff, these truths, are inside of all of us as well. And we're experiencing them all the time. And it's done in probabilities. You don't need to go into the science to understand it. But you are experiencing it. And every single person is going to experience it in a way that eventually leads them, you know, having worked with tons of addiction, I often say to some of the chemically dependent people I work with, did you get to an amount of heroin that was the right amount for you? And they all laugh because they're like, well, that doesn't exist. And why is that? What does using heroin eventually teach a person? To stop using it. Okay? In fact, all of our resentments and all the isms and all the negative energies that we're projecting out there is eventually teaching you to stop it because the pain gets greater and greater. And we're all playing this probability game whether we know it or not. You don't have to understand the science of it, and yet the science is there.